Hello, I'm so happy you stopped by. Welcome to this production breakdown of Black Yogurt. Now, I'm going to go through the entire Ableton session, go through it layer by layer, and just show you all of the elements that went into it. A brief backstory. The inspiration from the song initially came from me spinning the latest Dance with the Dead album called Driven to Madness on repeat for several weeks, if not months, after it came out. This tune was actually inspired by a riff in their song Hex from that album, which the first time I heard it, like when you first listen to a song, you have no idea where it's going to go. You don't know where it's flowing. You're not familiar with it at all, which obviously isn't the case once you've heard it a whole bunch of times. But the first time I hear something, I usually, my mind will sort of trail off and go like, hey, what if it went this way? And that's essentially what happened with Black Yogurt. Black Yogurt is sort of me taking on a thing that I thought I heard, or where I thought their track was going to go in that specific direction, and basically just rewrote it. The track just kind of snowballed into its own thing. But as sort of an Easter egg, I did use their track as the reference while working on my own, just for overall mix balances and stuff to kind of compare my production against. Yeah, so that's kind of cool, but it's obviously muted. I didn't sample anything from it. But the entire session is comprised of about 61 tracks and 4 returns or so. Here we got the drum bus. Typically all my sessions, as you may or may not know, are organized into 2 main buses. So one of them is the drum bus, where all the drums live, aptly named. And then there's the not drums bus, which typically will have a sidechain in it. I've been using this plugin called Shaperbox over the last few months for pretty much everything. So I have the main drums, which are actually in this case just comprised of the kick and 2 different snares that I use, or snares and claps or whatever, like so. And then down here we have this SC trigger, which is actually just it mirrors all of the kicks, same velocity, everything. I literally just select the whole thing and just drag and drop it. This is set up as an external instrument, which just sends those MIDI notes to an external thing, in this case Shaperbox and the not drums bus. And then every time a kick hits, it ducks out the entirety of the mix. And what's cool about that is you can actually really precisely draw in the curve, so you allow just the kick transient through, and then without pumping the mix too much, because I don't make tech house or anything like that, so I don't like to have my instrument buses to be pumping too much, so it's a stylistic choice. But anyway, so the drum bus here is comprised of all of the drums. In this case, we got the kicks and the snares and all that. Then I built this noise kit using a whole bunch of different percussion samples, hi-hats. These 4 here are kind of interesting because they're fairly similar hits, tonally, but they're all panned just a little differently. So 15%, 5%, 5 and 15 again, from left to right. It just kind of varies things up in the stereo field and keeps it interesting texturally. There's a whole bunch of movement from left to right as the track rolls on, but even for little rolls like this, they kind of go, which is neat. I've been having I always have a lot of fun building kits from scratch, and pretty much every track ends up using a different one. Should really start saving presets and reusing them, because I spend a lot of time making them and I only use them once. It keeps things interesting and varied from track to track, I suppose, but still it'd be a huge time saver. Although I have found myself kind of using similar samples, say snares. I think the snare that I used in this track is the same one that's in Hectoplasm, and I think there's a couple others that I used it in, so I find myself kind of gravitating towards a lot of the same ones, even as I'm sifting through the sample libraries. I'll be like, hey, I really like this one, and then later think about it and go, oh yeah, I've already used it before, it's already a favorite, I just didn't save it as a favorite. So anyway, that tangent aside. So yeah, we got main kit, we got the percussion kit, and then we got reverse cymbals and all that stuff. Later on, there's just this one section, cymbal chokes, which is just resampled from this Steven Slate drums bus, which I haven't used in a while, but in this case, I felt like for some of the more chuggy metal sections, it needed a little bit of that kind of organic, real drums, sort of overheads thing, because that's characteristic of metal, right? You just add a little bit more weight to the sampled drums and a little bit more depth, I guess, in a way. As per tradition, all of my drums are routed to this drum bus, which just has Ableton's, I think it's the hybrid reverb or whatever. It just makes for a really nice drum room, so it just sounds like, even though they're sample drums, but they're all in a room, which is neat. If I recall correctly, it's been a few months since I started this song. So I believe I started out with just the drums and the bass, which is this really cool fat Dune patch. Dune is a synth that I've been using extensively. It's since I got it, I think in November. I'm using it all the time. It's awesome. Tons of really, really wicked like factory presets in it. It's got a lot of 90s trance kind of saws in it, like, and a lot of like sounds from that era that I just are very nostalgic for me, but also just everything that's in it is a usable sound, which is cool. Like, you're flipping through it and you go, ooh, I could use this. Ooh, that inspires an idea. You know, like, I haven't bothered trying to create my own stuff in it because all the factory stuff is so next level that there's just no point. Anyway, it's wicked. But the patch in question was... And that is pretty much all over this track, like from the verses. Even the chug riff section. So it mirrors a lot of the guitar riffs and stuff. But yes, it was that. And then I think the other initial idea that I had that was completely outside of the chorus riff, because I think I started with the chorus riff and then built the intro around it and then started attaching all the verses and writing other crap and whatever. But this. And so in the intro, it's played by the Dune synth, and then it comes back a little bit later it's played by the Anna synth in a different section. Then while building the chorus, I made the bells. Gordy shits. So this here is basically just those bells resampled and reversed. Which kind of creates this cool, like, sucking in movement as they come back. More creepy harmonies. And there's another thing in the intro where, as the initial plucks open up, the filters and stuff like that, I resampled that, and then I threw this Arturia tape plugin on it to kind of make it lo-fi and just a little bit more warbled. It sounds nice. Now if we go back up to this section here, so this pre-snare womp thing is just kind of a little sucking in glitch that it adds weight to, like, on its own it doesn't really do much, but other than some textural things, but also in the heavier section it does add a bit of oomph to the snares. That's the point of it. Yeah, so in the intro we obviously have the drums, we have the intro pluck thing, there's like the... There were a few basses layered on top of one another. We got like the chunky fat one. We've got the, call it narwhal, because it's a wall of gnar. Essentially it's this. So I made this patch, I don't remember, months ago, last summer I think, and it actually layers very nicely with walls of guitars, because if it's kind of like, it sounds just wide enough that it fits in the stereo field, kind of between them. Yeah, this patch is really good at adding articulation to like big chunky guitar riffs, just because of how sharp it sounds. It's just like a modified Pigments preset. Most of what's happening with the movement of this is this band pass, where I'm basically just moving the cutoff of it. Sounds kind of neat. After that, we got this other... Let's layer it together. a little bit of added oomph, I guess. And then we have like this acid patch, which I think was massive. I just wanted this kind of like 303 sounding thing to harken back to the 90s acid days, which is pretty prevalent in full force in the chorus later. So after that, so after the intro builds, we got the first verse, this Atmo pad, which is, I can't remember what it might be resampled from like Ethereal Earth or something by Native Instruments, but the reason why I resampled it was A, to save on processing power, and B, so I could kind of cut it up here at the end to fit rhythmically with everything else that was going on. But it's basically just... There's this creepy breath. Yeah. Crash. That's sidechained. Pretty standard stuff. But this pad here at the end. I wanted to make room, I think, partially for this transpluck, which occurs in a few places in the track. Like later on, it adds a little bit of, it kind of supplements the plucks that the guitars are doing, and like the what I call this spooky verse. That's later. The usual assortment of risers and a couple neat things about the what I call the Chugga Verse. I probably called it that because of the chunky bass that's prevalent in it. But for one, like I had these guitar tracks, I call this the FT bus because it's my, what I call it, Franken Telly. It's a guitar, I'll actually grab it here. It's kind of interesting. It's a hand-built, sort of hollow body Telecaster looking thing with a knockoff Bigsby on it that somebody built by hand. I have no idea who it was. This was just gifted to me by an old acquaintance. It's cool. It was just, I wanted to use this as an excuse to kind of throw it on because it actually sounds really nice, clean, and I'd actually be curious to record it acoustically as well. Just stick a mic in front of it and just kind of see what sort of textures that brings in. But yeah, it's kind of neat. Most of the clean sounds on this track were done using that guitar. Tracks are hard panned left and right, as per tradition. The other kind of interesting sound designy nerdy thing was, as I was writing the verse and I was listening back to it and just thinking, oh, what other crap should I throw in there? And I think like I accidentally bumped into my desk or something, and there was like a rattle from right in that little corner there, and that actually not only sounded kind of interesting texturally, but it actually fit rhythmically with the playback. So it's like, hey, why not record it? And so I did. I'll actually replicate it right now because it's still there. And then the other thing that the mic picked up at the same time was my power conditioner, which is noisier than I thought it was. I can't hear it from sitting over here, but it hums. Imagine that. As a result, I ended up with this kind of sample that ended up chopping up a bunch. So I created this whole like effects chain for it. Expand out the original sample. Yes, there's a whole bunch of like takes of me hitting this thing. And just chopped it up and placed it in various parts of the track. It also makes kind of a comeback a little bit later during like kind of a build here. Also featured is the sound of my coffee mug being slid off my table. This thing's just full of all kinds of interesting sonic textures. I definitely plan on sampling it a whole bunch in the future too for percussion stuff. But yeah, that's featured in that section. That's kind of about it for the Chugga Verse. The main chorus, of course. So most of the elements you've already heard. One exception being this kind of what I call the doom scream, because it sounds like I think somebody was trying to, like, I use a Pigments patch. I've been using it quite a bit because I've been nerding out over the last several months on the work of Mick Gordon. He's the guy who created the game soundtracks for Doom 2016 and Doom 2020. I guess a bit of that, Doom Eternal. Anyway, there's this patch in here called Demonizer in Pigments that's it sounds like they were trying to replicate the sound of this crazy distortion chain that Mick had built. That was essentially the basis of a lot of the instrumentation for those soundtracks. And it's cool because if you tweak the mod wheel, it's gnarly. Yeah, I've been using this patch quite a bit as of late, but I threw it in here just because the whole point of this track was to try to sound as evil as possible, and it just seemed like a fitting tribute to squeeze something like this in there. But so that growly bit in the chorus is a combination of that. I think I automated it, like a combination of the pitch falling and then the mod wheel jumping up a little bit, and so a little bit of movement there. And then there's like these two things, which I think I used other Pigments patches for, just tweaked and resampled and layered. Heavily saturated, obviously. So together you get pretty thick. Other than that, in the chorus there's like this little plucky thing. It's not too obvious, it's pretty buried in the mix, but just adds a little bit of interesting texture, I guess, to the rest of it. And there's this like glide lead that follows after all that. Just add a little bit more textural stuff to the rest of it. That's kind of similar to the intro, just some more drum movement going on. The spooky verse. It's one of the many Dune presets that I used in there. It's very eerie and stuff. And there's that trance pluck again. I think that was also a Dune preset. The guitar harmonies. The desk effects make a comeback. And kind of like dreamy pads or whatever. Then we got the Chugga Verse. For whatever reason, it just felt like the track wanted to go that way, so hey, whatever. Yeah, so then we got like the weird, creepy build, which it almost sounds like I used a Contact library with like this Cuban hand ensemble thing. For some reason, when I hear it, I imagine people playing on skulls or something, like just like tapping on like just human bones and whatever. Like I think it was just the kind of atmosphere that this track had already painted, being as evil sounding as it is. It sounds like a weird skeleton rave or something. The other thing that comes in is this, and speaking of me being inspired by the work of Mick Gordon, I was binging on a bunch of his podcast interviews and stuff, and on a couple of them he brought up this curious instrument called the Kangling, which he had acquired a few years back. And what it is, look it up. It's pretty cool if you're not familiar. It's Tibetan death flute, and it's fashioned out of a human femur. I don't know where they get these femurs. I don't want to know. Yeah, it's really freaking interesting. On its own, it sounds horrible, but if you throw on a ton of reverb, it has this really cool, eerie, creepy atmosphere to it. I actually ended up stumbling across another Contact instrument. It sounds like this. Versus no reverb, this is what it sounds like. Like a bad fart. The difference that good reverb makes. So anyway, that was that sampled and stuff, and then other than that I had a drone. And then some strings, which is another contact library. Very horror-esque. Finally, the heavy section was fun because it was just like. So it was interesting because it was like a good exercise, and even though there's so many elements happening all at once and you want things to sound really heavy, but ironically, the more things you stack on one another, the more things start to wash out, get masked. There's kind of a point of diminishing returns with there. So the key I found is to try to make space for everything and give it its own little tiny spotlight as much as you can. So part of what makes that section punch is the fact that only the snare is allowed to come through during certain bits. So I guess for the first half of that, you have like all of the hits, like the instrumental bombs, and then you have just the snare. Yeah, the guitars, I really made a point to chop up so they don't interfere with the snare transient or anything, right? And then later they get chunkier. So basically go from like octaves to playing the full bar chords or whatever. The leads are obviously going the whole time. And then underneath the guitars, yeah, so that's just basically like that Doom patch layered with. But that one is, yeah, it was really fun to craft together and just make really beefy and chunky. I actually admittedly really struggled with the arrangement for this track. Like there's a lot of different parts that I was moving around back and forth. It wasn't flowing very well. I'm really happy with the way that it is now, but it took a long time to get there. And so like there's actually kind of a reject bit right there. So because I was like, hey, what if, it sounds really evil and very heavy and sinister, but what if it just kind of, just for contrast's sake, exploded into like this really dreamy sequence right in the middle and then went right back down to the evilness, right? So I started mapping out, this is another really cool like tune pad arpeggiator thing. Made sense in terms of like the key and stuff like that, but it's just this. Which, like, listening back to it now makes no sense to have in the track, but it was there. I just kind of slid it off to the side. Maybe I'll use it. Whatever. I think the idea was that it was going to go main riff, then into that dreamy sequence, and then it was going to go into, like, that spooky build or whatever to tie back into the evil theme and then wrap it up. But then, already the track is 5.5 minutes long, and as of late, I've been trying to force myself to just trim the fat and just get to the point, even though it's fun to explore like different progressions and like, what if it flows this way? What if it goes that way? It makes sense for some tracks, but not others. Like I like progressive things, but sometimes it just feels like something's just too drawn out. So I've been trying to just simplify as of late, and this already still feels kind of all over the map, but yeah, that's kind of the gist of it, really. I guess the one final thing is like this cool little, it only shows up in the first chunk of verse, but this like guitar atmospheric thing. What it was me cranking up the reverb and the delays and stuff on the clean guitar and then just running my pick down across the strings. I just wanted to add some additional atmosphere to the background, so it just sounds like this. Just kind of panned from right to left and whatever, give it a little bit of movement. But that was kind of the gist of it, really. From there, I just bounced out this mix into a separate mastering session, mastered it, and there it is as it exists today. And finally, a quick note about the artwork. So I'd once again enlisted the incredible, illustrious talents of my partner, Bex. I was toying around with the idea of like, black yogurt, what is it? And are you next? But the initial idea that we toyed around with was if you were looking down, like bird's eye view at like a yogurt cup, and like inside it looked like a bottomless well and with like two creepy eyes at the bottom. That was one thing, but I tried doing that, but my Photoshop compositing skills really weren't up to snuff as to what I had in the back of my head. I just couldn't make it look good. So instead, Bex was ever so kind to hand draw in Procreate a weird, creepy tentacle monster poking out, like lifting the lid of a yogurt cup and oozing out and stuff. I couldn't tell you, much like most of my track titles, where this one came from. It was just something that I had written down in my list, and I don't know, it just seemed fitting to create a very sinister sounding track to black yogurt. I don't know. There it is. Anyway, hope this is at least somewhat interesting. As always, fire any questions my way. I'm happy to unveil any other dark secrets, but hope you dig the tune. Thanks for checking in.